Escape velocity is defined as the minimal velocity that a body must obtain in order to escape from the gravitational field of a celestial body. In the 20th century, Luna 1, a spacecraft manufactured by the then Soviet Union, was the first object to obtain escape velocity by breaching Earth's exosphere. Some years later, human-manned aircraft achieved the same feat. One need only sit back and consider just how quickly these events took place. From the first documented and sustained flight made by the Wright brothers in 1903 to less than a century later, when we can observe manned aircraft flying into space. A similar phenomenon can be observed with the emergence of computer technology, from computers weighing several hundred kilograms in the 1950s and 1960s to the present day, when some are nearly as thin and as light as a sheet of paper, and yet possessing far more processing power than had any machine of decades prior. There seems to the observant person to be a continuum of technological progress, mechanical progress as I am inclined to call it, that is virtually unabated and unbroken from the time of the most basic breakthroughs in the early 20th century to feats far beyond them, building upon the original discoveries. The possible reasons for this have been explored and explained by Ray Kurzweil, invoking his law of accelerating returns, defined as a new evolutionary process whereby positive feedback increases in order exponentially. If this is correct, then the mechanical progress of the 21st century shall be measured not in a century's worth of time, but rather 20 millennia when weighed against past progress in human history. A correlate of this is that the quote-unquote returns of an evolutionary process, such as the speed, cost-effectiveness, or overall power of a process, also increase exponentially over time. This is thought to apply to both biological systems as well as technological systems. You may already be asking yourself why it is I mention this at all, since ostensibly it seems to have little or nothing to do with issues I've talked about in the past, but I assure you there is method to the madness. In this video I seek to map out what is salient about the human ape, what makes him unique among animals, and moving from there, I wish to propose a possible way forward for the species, which, unlikely to be realized as it may be, is something that is at least theoretically feasible within the framework of the possibilities in the year 2014. As such, this video will be covering a large range of topics, all of them important to the matter at hand. The expansion of the understanding of mechanical systems grows, continually yielding greater and greater advances with each passing decade, and indeed the same could be said for most of the physical sciences. When looking upon the grand scale of technological progress, we might rightly call the time lapse between milestones not but a midsummer night's dream, particularly in light of the fact that for the vast majority of our history, we were confined to locomotion with our feet and limited to simple tools made of wood and stone that served only as the most basic means of survival. Taking this into account makes the past century and where we stand today nothing short of astonishing. The law of accelerating returns might apply to both biological and technological systems, but its application, it appears to me, is more limited in purely biological systems, at least as it applies to the relative speed of exponential returns. Of course, over time, beginning with a single-celled organism and building upon that, this is true, but such progress takes a great deal longer than it does with purely mechanical systems. Which is why, to the same observant person, it should also be glaringly apparent that this exponential progress took place primarily in a realm external to the human, which is to say that though man no doubt benefited from mechanical progress and propelled it forward, he himself was never the subject and direct recipient of this progress to the same degree. And it is here that I wish to distinguish the mechanical from the biological. Human progress, which once again I seek to distinguish from mechanical progress in this context, has been lagging far behind in terms of scope compared to technological progress, and there are several reasons for this. One reason is simple. The flesh is weak, as is sometimes said, and there are real constraints when it comes to progress as an organic, biological system and species, whose hardware and software required millions of years to evolve. For example, even as I write this, I'm in mild discomfort as my body grapples with an artificial mesh grafted onto the wall of my abdominal cavity to prevent my guts from spilling into my scrotum. These things take a while. We have very real and noticeable physical limits and limitations. In the messy realm of flesh and blood, in the realm of biology, we have been and remain very much prisoners of our origins. Medicine can only proceed as quickly as the human body can accept its innovations, which of course could not be said for the turbines of a plane or the microchips of a motherboard. Human progress has always been hindered in this regard. But I see this as only part of the problem, and a smaller part, in fact, than the mental, emotional, and psychological barriers that would have evolved along with us, and that we continue to erect around ourselves to cloud our minds in an effort to evade unpleasant facts and truths. Truths better confronted at face value than shrinking back in fear from them. We are in this day and age just as much hostage to the same drives and instincts as we were tens of thousands of years ago, though rather conspicuously we tend not to believe that, and to the extent that we do, we are loath to concede it. This is nothing other than the evolutionary autopilot I had mentioned prior at work in previous videos, the automaticity of thought and action that only makes sense in the context of a primitive hunter-gatherer species eking out existence in the Pleistocene, but temporally transposed to the early 21st century. And collectively, as well as individually, we have a choice as a species. We can simply let things run their course and continue to remain beholden to primal urges that help us little and even harm us in some circumstances. Or we can attempt, at least in part, to start from scratch, fully taking into account how we got here, and more importantly, what we are. To do so, we must question assumptions and alleged truths that some believe are immutable and irrefutable, and reorganize our minds with a view towards the future, all the while remaining acutely aware of the fact of where we came from in the past and where we are right now, in the present. To this end, I begin by posing the simple question, what is unique about the human ape? What makes the human ape unique amongst the cornucopia of biodiversity on planet Earth, amongst other apes and intelligent mammals, and what faculties are responsible for this uniqueness? Without posing this question and attempting to answer it in an intellectually honest manner, we will forever remain shackled in biological lockstep, repeating failed strategies of the past, all the while pretending to ourselves that these strategies are optimized for the present and the future. And returning to the original sense of the video, how does man, metaphorically speaking, achieve escape velocity? I speak here, of course, of a terrestrial escape velocity, earthly, whereby the requirement for it is to achieve a minimal cognitive awareness and capacity in order that we might exceed ourselves and our limitations, which would mean, of course, surpassing congenital biological limitations, and that itself requires a very, very, very pronounced awareness of them. The question of what makes us unique is perhaps the most fundamental question we can ask ourselves, because understanding its answer is the key to understanding the basis of human progress, as well as the basis for advancing human civilization. We can begin to answer this question by examining the family. Now, to date, I've always given short shrift to questions of the family, and specifically to questions of family structure, but I do believe it important to understand if we're to arrive at correct answers, and in doing so, I shall surely be addressing the claim that the nuclear family is the alleged building block of civilization, a slogan bandied about with no thought as to its actual content. The claim goes that without the nuclear family there would be no semblance of civilization, so let's examine that. And it's important to do our best to remain rational when speaking of the family, since any discussion about the family tends to provoke people into emotional knee-jerking with little objective remaining. The family, like anything else in the world, can and should be studied irrespective of whatever preconceived biases and notions we might have, or wishful thinking we're inclined to engage in. So the basic question is, what is the family? But before I begin, I should preface this with a statement that, all claims to the contrary notwithstanding, I have no interest in trying to destroy the family, nuclear or otherwise. I merely wish to arrive at the most accurate understanding and definition possible of what a family is, in order to examine the claim of whether or not a particular version of it, the nuclear family in this case, is, as many claim, the building block of civilization. On the surface, this might seem to have a number of plausible answers, because it could be thought that the definition is merely an opinion. But in staying true to facts, what is the family? Very simply put, the family is a group of genetically related individuals that band together because of that genetic relatedness. In short, a family, no matter what the particulars of its structure, something I will come to later, is a socially organized genetic replication unit, with shared genes being the primary cause of said social organization. Animals, including humans, organize themselves into cohesive units due to shared genetic heritage in order to better survive and replicate that common genetic heritage into the future. It's that simple. It is, at base, nothing more or less than that. All animals, including humans, have natural inclinations to prefer genetic relatives over strangers, though this is simply a rule of thumb for humans since the bonds of blood can often be tenuous at best, and genetically unrelated friendships can sometimes be more enduring than alliances of blood. Put briefly, genetic relatedness is hardly a guarantor of getting along or even liking each other. That genetically related individuals, such as parents and children, as well as siblings, would converge into organized units makes sense in this context. Natural preferences for genetic kin, as well as the advantages of group cohesion and social organization, lend themselves to this, and interestingly enough, humans are not the only species to sport such socially organized replication units. And most warm-blooded species also have some sort of family or genetic replication unit, and intelligent mammals, particularly cetaceans and other great apes, have fairly complex genetic replication units. There is no question as to whether or not a socially organized genetic replication unit contributes some part to the survival of the species, better than a lack thereof. But there is a stark difference between making the claim that something is the building block, and please note the definite article, and that something makes a contribution. I had noted before in my previous video on collectivism that collectivism originated in the need to band together for the purposes of survival because cooperation and organization made life easier than trying to survive alone. But one should stress that cooperation and organization are the important factor here, and that the collusion of individuals into groups might well have begun on the basis of genetic relatedness, but quickly moved beyond that because moving beyond genetic kin was a virtual necessity in response to a harsh environment and demanded larger-scale cooperation. Whilst it is true that sharing joint DNA seems to motivate many, the most important operative factor in humans and other higher mammals is collusion and cooperation in order to achieve common goals, whatever those goals might be, independent of DNA. The shared DNA people have does tend to drive individuals to invest more in that DNA, but without the organizational principle, one could not achieve anything, let alone a civilization, if only for reasons of pure numbers. The construction of a city-state will require the participation of many, not just the genetically related, which is why, had the organizational principle not extended itself beyond genetic circles, there would be nothing akin to civilization whatsoever. So a family is a simple structure of genetically related individuals investing resources in progeny and kin. If you strip the family down to their bare bones, it is a pretty simple thing, and it certainly does not account for skyscrapers, mobile telephones, and automobiles. To this end, I want to look at familial structure and related apes. The reason why we wish to examine particular familial structures is that it's implicit in the claim that the nuclear family is the building block of civilization, that there's a structural particular within that nuclear family that births civilization, whereas other familial structures do not, by contrast. Primates across diverse species display highly differentiated familial structures, ranging from a single female and her offspring, best typified by orangutans and found in humans as well, monogamous pairs of female and male, seen in gibbons and also found in humans, polyandrous groups found in New World marmosets and humans, alpha male with several females, best exemplified in gorillas, and also seen in humans, multi-female, multi-male groups found in macaques, and fission-fusion groups typified by chimpanzees. Thus, primates display 7 different types of familial structure, where in humans, 5 of the 7 find application. It's hard to extract a hypothesis from a slogan-like statement such as the nuclear family is the building block of civilization. But if it were, we would almost certainly see civilizations arise in primates that display monogamous pair-bonded familial structures, such as gibbons, tarsiers, and siamangs. Moreover, the monogamous pair-bonded family is not just found in primates, but in other species, including, but not limited to, swans, French angelfish, prairie voles, turtle doves, bald eagles, and even the parasite Schistosoma mansomi worm. And interestingly enough, amongst these animals, they tend to practice the tenets of nuclear family-style pair bonding far more consistently than humans do, where we see a lot more variation and deviation. So why, then, do we not see anything even mildly resembling what we could call civilization in a species such as gibbons or siamangs? Good question. And before I proceed, just so I can get it out of the way, The endless back and forth about nuclear family and extended family is also solved by this, since a diverse individual family structure is found in numerous species, including the equivalence of extended family, and it does not seem to yield anything resembling civilization. So we can eliminate the possibility that monogamous pair bonding alone is a prerequisite for what we call civilization. And in fact, we probably can call into doubt the entire idea and theory. Is it then a combination of nuclear-style family and something else that leads to human civilization? And once again, this is a question that can be analyzed fully and answered, I believe. The better question is, what effects does upbringing alone have on personality and intelligence, as well as other behavioral outcomes, if we posit that intelligence is vitally important to the erection and maintenance of complex structures, social or otherwise, i.e., civilization? To answer this question, however, we need to understand certain elements of behavioral genetics, particularly in the realm of heredity. And after over 5 decades of study, there are firmly established 3 laws of behavioral genetics, and they are as follows. Law 1, all human behavioral traits are heritable. Law 2, the effect of being raised in the same family is smaller than the effect of the genes. And 3, a substantial portion of variation in complex human behavioral traits is not accounted for by the effects of genes or families. Concerning the first law, heritability has 2 definitions, one being statistical, where it is defined as the proportion of phenotypic variance that is attributable to genetic variance, and another more basic definition, the degree to which genetics contribute to different observable traits. For the purposes of clarification, a genotype refers to a person's genetic composition, his building blocks, here no pun intended, and a phenotype refers to both outward physical characteristics such as height and eye color, as well as behavioral ones. Both genotype and the environment interacting with a person have an effect on phenotype. For example, in the case of height, and this is a random example, there's a genetically determined range, say 1 meter 72 centimeters to 1 meter 82 centimeters that a person can grow into, where non-genetic factors do play a role, such as nutrition, stress, sleep, and so on, but not beyond the genetic potential limits already in place, and I'll speak a little bit later on epigenetics as it relates to this maybe. Since heritability is proportional in nature, there will be a range for which behavioral traits are considered to be influenced by the genes. Where influence is defined as 0.0, there is no genetic influence on behavioral traits, including intelligence, to 1.0, genes are the sole influence. And most studies have resulted in findings of a range of 0.35 to 0.65, yielding a mean of about 50%. Individual traits, however, will have differing degrees of heritability. For example, intelligence heritability lies somewhere between 0.6 and 0.8, yielding a mean of 70%. And the percentage of intelligence heritability increases as a person ages, and I'll be coming back to intelligence later. Now, the second law states that the effect of being raised in the same family is smaller than the effect of genes. It's important to note the same family, nuclear, right? Here we must distinguish between shared environment and unique environment, growing up in the same household, having the same parents, etc., versus everything else that a person receives as input from the world. And this is effectively the nature versus nurture debate. And I'm going to quote the cognitive psychologist Steven Pinker here. Quote, "The shared environment is that which impinges on both siblings alike. The unique environment is everything else, that which impinges on one sibling but not another. Studies show that the effect of shared environment is small, just 0 to 10% of the variance. Adult siblings are equally similar whether they grew up together or apart. Adoptive siblings are no more similar than 2 people plucked off the street at random. Identical twins are no more similar than one would expect from the effects of their shared genes." Which is to say that family environment has little to no effect whatsoever on children, and later even less effect on adults, including intelligence, and I'll come back to that later as it relates to family structure. And the third law states a substantial portion of variation in complex human behavioral traits is not accounted for by the effects of genes or families, and accounts for everything else, and it's not well defined. So children and adults are far more influenced by peer groups than they are parents or family members. And this is seen, for example, in the near effortless linguistic and social assimilation of children of immigrants, who both unconsciously and consciously assign greater importance to the peer group with respect to social adaptation, language acquisition, and many other things than they do to genetically related parent groups. And you can see in the same instance, the genetically related group, i.e. the parents in this case, struggling in that environment, not able to adapt. And this makes sense in evolutionary terms, as a newer generation can face different challenges than an older generation, and children and young adults seek to assimilate into a group of similarly aged peers, building up later towards reproductive competition. And many of the effects that fall into the third law are unpredictable environmental occurrences, such as severe accidents, particular relationships, trauma, and virtually everything else. I went through this to return to the central question, of course. What is it about the nuclear family that can be justified on scientifically rigorous grounds that accounts for civilization, whereas other family structures do not? Or even, for that matter, lack of family? Is it, for example, a literal impossibility for genetically unrelated individuals to band together and accomplish things? Well, obviously not. So I'll quote Pinker again. Quote, "It's not that parents don't matter. In many ways, parents matter a great deal. For most of human existence, the most important thing parents did for their children was to keep their children alive. And children appear to need some kind of nurturing figure in their early years, though it needn't be a parent, and possibly not even an adult. Young orphans and refugees often turn out relatively well, even if they had no parents or adults around them." End quote. Parents' genetic investment in their own progeny is clearly a large motivator for keeping them alive long enough so the children can reproduce themselves. But parental investment alone hardly seems to be the basis for human civilization, since, as has been shown, genes and unique factors outside of what parents do and how they do it have a greater influence on people's intelligence and behavior and abilities than styles of parenting do. Or, for that matter, whether families nuclear, extended, or something else entirely. And barring cases of severe neglect and abuse in children, adults tend to turn out to be what they are and will be regardless of parental input in terms of their personalities, abilities, and intelligence. So it's hard to reconcile these facts with any of the feel-goodisms that dominate the discourse on the topic relating to family. So let's return to what we've in fact ascertained to be truly vital. Clearly, social organization, collusion, and the willingness to work together with others is more important than the particulars of family structure or lack thereof. And I think we're moving closer to solving the puzzle. And we can also be sure, due to the 3 laws of behavior genetics, how little impact shared family structure and environment has on us, particularly in the realm of intelligence. But once again, many species of animals cooperate and form coalitions to achieve goals, from insects such as termites to cetaceans such as bottlenose dolphins and orcas. And yet, despite this, we see nothing among them resembling what we call civilization. So there has to be, therefore, something unique to humans that is absent in other species that has allowed us to escape from the confines of living in caves and barely surviving as hunter-gatherers. We call this language and cognition. Most animals have some rudimentary form of cognition, and most species of whales and dolphins have fairly complex means of communicating with each other, to the point where one might well call this communication language. So it must be a property, a specific property of human cognition and or of human language that separates rudimentary displays of communication and thought from what we see in other species, from the human variation in this regard. And to delve more deeply into the evolutionary development of the human brain, as well as language, would really be beyond the scope of this video, as it would take far too long. But we can and should examine certain qualities in order to ascertain salient differences between the human ape and other species. Now, one way of approaching this is to use the Encephalization Quotient, which is the measurement of the relative size of the brain of a particular species compared with the expected value for members of the group to which it belongs, and is generally only applied to mammals and sometimes birds. Now, a logarithmic plot of brain mass against body mass for a diverse representative species has a slope of roughly 3/4, which provides the baseline for calculating EQ values, Encephalization Quotient. The EQ corresponds to the distance above or below this line, and an EQ of 1 equates to the brain mass expected for the group. In mammals and birds, the formula for calculating EQ is brain mass divided by 0.12 times body mass to the 0.66 power. Humans have the highest values, followed by bottlenose dolphins and orcas. In layman's terms, the encephalation quotient simply measures relative brain mass to relative body mass. So this is part of the puzzle, but it's only part. The fact that childbirth is significantly more dangerous for human females than it is for other species is related to the fact of just how large our skulls are, proportionally speaking, compared to other apes, and implies that despite the disadvantage such a large cranium brought with itself, as well as the longer periods of relative helplessness for newborns and babies compared to other species, the adaptive trade-off was worth it. Additionally, returning back to the point on social organization, the more social a species, as opposed to solitary, the greater the encephalation quotient tends to be, with social carnivores generally scoring better than less social herbivores. But it seems a stretch to say that merely having a high encephalation quotient is enough to produce human civilization. And I do not believe that the capacity to birth such a thing lies solely in the realm of logarithmically outperforming bottlenose dolphins, though in a sense that's sort of true. One final physical aspect of the brain I wish to speak of is the mammalian neocortex. Only mammals possess a neocortex, thus making it a recent evolutionary development. And in humans, it appears to be the most developed in all. In humans, 90% of the cerebral cortex is the neocortex, and by way of comparison, chimpanzees have a 30-to-1 ratio of neocortical gray matter to size of the medulla brainstem, compared to a human ratio of 60-to-1. And most higher cognitive functions take place in the neocortex, including language and spatial processing. So part of the human edge over other animals, and even fellow apes, is to the degree to which the neocortex has evolved and developed in humans, which leads us to a final point. Talking about the evolutionary development of the brain in humans and how it developed alongside other features such as a lowering of the jawbone and changes in the vocal tract would be a video unto itself, even though it's related. So I'd like to now turn to a mathematical and linguistic feature that I believe is key to understanding why human beings are salient amongst other animals. So many of you might be familiar with the term recursion, or discrete infinity, from mathematics or computer science, where it means defining a function by repeatedly applying an algorithm. And recursion can be illustrated visually as well. And as can be seen in this case, with one picture being contained within another, and so on, ad infinitum. But what's far more interesting, and I believe ultimately essential to understanding salient human nature and capacity, is that recursion is clearly a property of human thought, and not coincidentally a property of human language. Human language, no matter what that language might be, has been documented to be universally recursive or discretely infinite. And this can be seen in the example of multiple embedded English clauses. So for this particular example, Mary believes that Stephen thinks that we said that yesterday the weather was worse than today because it would not stop raining yesterday, which is why they had to cancel the trip that they had been planning for such a long time, since saving all that money for the trip would have been wasted had they taken the trip under such poor weather conditions, and so on. It goes on into infinity. And we can see the potential for embedding continues infinitely, and this recursive property is likely the most important of the many properties of human language. With it, there's no practical limit to human discourse, and consequently to the expression of thought, likewise discretely infinite via language. And the fact that the recursion can be seen both in the physical world and that it can be represented mathematically is highly suggestive of a connection between man's ability to manipulate his environment via his understanding of mathematics and physical processes that would otherwise be absent were human language not recursive in nature. And it's for this reason that I believe other species, whatever their intelligence and communicative abilities might be, cannot replicate what human beings have done, namely because their mental apparatus is not recursive. We can also observe that human thought is recursive, though we cannot illustrate it by way of functions or writing. And to be sure, there's a distinction between thought and language, and there are thought processes that do not occur in the context of language, but many thoughts, and certainly the most complex sort of thoughts, do seem to occur within a linguistic framework. Specifically, higher cognitive functions that require the presence of a well-developed neocortex, such as the kind that humans possess, appear to take place in a linguistic context, whether the thought might be related to plotting a graph, composing an alliterative verse, or reading an instruction manual. The map being drawn requires a linguistic representation in our thoughts. And humans appear hardwired to both think and speak recursively, and this allows for the propagation of ideas, concepts, and memes. Without limitless potential in the form of ideas, be they mathematical, philosophical, or something else entirely, there would be no such thing as civilization. Of course, as a species, we tend to take all of this for granted, but this does nothing to change the fact that without recursive thought and language, we would have gone nowhere rather fast. And memes go hand in hand with this. I think in recent years, many tend to attribute to memes primarily negative qualities, but memes are by definition simply ideas or behaviors that are transmitted from one person to another within a culture. And they can be good or bad and can cover any subject matter. And once again, uniquely amongst animal species, we have a long tradition of mimetic propagation. And we're the only species that sometimes assigns greater value to mimetic propagation than we do genetic propagation, a point which I believe is vital in turning the currently moribund society we live in around. By means of our advanced cognitive faculties and recursive language, positive memes in the form of abstract mathematical and scientific ideas, but also the whole gamut of technique-based memes for farming, building, and related fields, have allowed us to surpass every other species on the planet, and to colonize virtually every known living space on the planet, ranging from the tundra to jungle to desert. And memes, whether great or small, are the greatest transformative byproducts that stem from our cognitive evolution, ranging from agriculture to notions about government structure to the Newtonian laws of motion. Who can rationally deny that there's any force more influential than memes? Now, you might argue that it's genes, and in a sense that's correct, since our capacity for recursive communication and thought, as well as mimetic propagation, is encoded in our genome. But that is a given right now. And the real question that weighs on our shoulders in the year 2014 is what we as a species, and individually as men and women, choose to do with the attributes evolution has gifted us with. Should we enhance the salient and build upon it, or should we prod along as nether apes, ignoring our ancestry and our heritage? So let's summarize what's been discussed. Social cohesion and general principles of organization are more important than the specifics of family structure and even genetic alliance. A greater encephalization quotient, more developed neocortex, and a brain that produces recursive thought and language with the capacity for meme propagation have allowed us to do things that no other species has done. And that makes us truly unique amongst animals. And it's not the specifics of family structure or the eating, shitting, and breeding that every other species on the planet on planet Earth engages in. Let's be frank. Without the aforementioned developments in human prehistory, the nuclear family, claimed though it is to be the so-called building block of civilization, would be the building block of rummaging through caves and meandering about the plains in aimlessness, seeking and caring only about sustenance and the next fuck. And frankly, when we look out the window, sometimes many of our species still find themselves in this mode of being. But that's neither here nor there. Thus, in having clarified and explained the sources of man's unique gifts, I'll now address and partly reprise the theme of maladaptation within the context of those gifts, and argue that maladaptation goes far beyond the genetic, physiological, which I talked about prior, and penetrates into the realm of the mimetic as well. And if we wish to rise out of the current mire, we can only do so by recognizing what first allowed us to leave the caves and created all the technological marvels of the past and present. I'll argue that memes, though they as well as everything else arises from physical biomechanical processes, are ultimately more powerful than genes. That is to say, the product is more powerful than the source. Think about Isaac Newton's Principia Mathematica. Printing and writing are themselves memes developed at different intervals, which then proliferated and have allowed for the continued transmission of human knowledge. And these memes then combine with Newton's mathematical means, resulting in a masterpiece of human intellectual achievement. In the breadth and scope of its influence, Newton's thoughts, transcribed on paper, have arguably transformed human civilization more than any singular genetic contribution has done, barring perhaps his parents copulating and giving birth to Newton, of course. In this way, memes build upon memes, resulting in potentially limitless combinations of them becoming ever more complex. So the number of memes, for example, that resulted in the creation of the laptop I'm now using to script this video could well number in the many hundreds or thousands, if not more. And it might be that the ever-expanding font of human knowledge has rendered the number of memes we have uncountable. I like to call this process mimetic accumulation. One meme builds upon the other, and so on. Mimetic accumulation. But you see now that the specific properties of the human brain, and I believe even more specifically recursion, this particular property of recursion, allow for the generation of potentially infinite ideas, and the plausible implementation of those ideas within the limits of our current understanding, of course. And so, returning to our original question of what makes us uniquely human one last time, it is clearly not the structural particulars of specific family arrangements, nor particular parental investment, which is a consequence of cognitive developments in humans, not a precursor to it, or anything else one might find in common folk wisdom. And if we can identify the sources of man's unique gifts, which I believe to have identified adequately, so too can we find an optimal path forward and fully exploit those gifts. So let me now turn to a topic that I had talked about in an earlier video, namely maladaptation. And at the time, I focused mainly on specific physiological maladaptive traits relating to nutrition and exercise that didn't sync too well with modernity. But I want to go beyond that now and look even further at maladaptive breeding rituals and practices that we engage in as a species, because I believe this is absolutely key if we want to build a truly advanced civilization. And it's a point I will expand on later. To begin our examination, let's first look at the most basic principles of attraction in the mating ritual, the things that men and women respectively value in a general sense with only minimum variation in those values. I'm speaking, of course, of human attractive universals that are valid for the entirety of, say, men, the entirety of women, or crisscrossing over into both domains. So I want to first look at men and what men find most interesting, if you want to call it that, in women, in the hopes of answering the question, are human male breeding inclinations and prerequisites optimized for an advanced civilization? So unsurprisingly, one of the most important factors for men, and this has been researched extensively, is the waist-to-hip ratio, which has been determined to be near optimal at 0.7, or where the waist is 70% of the hip's width. And I'm speaking of the unspoken primal instinctive feelings of attraction that men feel towards this, the unconscious versus the conscious, the reptilian brain. And this appears to be a good indicator, at least ostensibly, of female fertility and childbearing capacity. And this comes in addition to clean skin, high levels of estrogen, as well as something that holds true for both sexes, symmetrical facial features. Most men instinctively find these things attractive and very important, and they tend to form the basis of the attraction that men feel for women, no matter the plausible or implausible narrative men are wont to tell themselves. And Barbarossa had touched on this indirectly in his Powered by Orgasm video in describing what is likely to be the typical housewife. And we can see this in the sorts of women whom men find most attractive. And we can ask ourselves a simple question. Are evolutionary instigated prerequisites and inclinations in female attractiveness still the optimized model for an advanced and modern civilization? Is a woman with an IQ of 80 but with a perfect waist-to-hip ratio and gleaming skin and hair the harbinger of a generation that will take us to the stars? Or is the exercise of drive that shaped us under very specific and highly primitive circumstances perhaps not so optimized for modernity? And the question is only partly rhetorical. And what can be said of human female preferences and instincts? They have, of course, been examined in great detail in previous videos, hypergamy, etc. But for the purposes of clarification, let's state them once again. Physically, women are inclined to tall, broad-shouldered males with symmetrical faces, and we all know they like men with resources being defined as whatever the currency might be for the day, be it meat, political power, money, whatever. And once again, we can ask ourselves a question in a similar vein to the question we pose with regards to men. Is a professional athlete worth millions, with an IQ of 80, rich in monetary resource and acquisitions, the basis of seeding the world with intellectual heirs to a Watson and Crick or an Einstein? Once again, only partly rhetorical. So let me provide you with a context for these questions. Many of you might be familiar with the theoretical physicist and popularizer of science, Michio Kaku, who has often spoken of civilisational types, and this is often referred to as the Kardashev scale, named after the astronomer who created basically the concept, and it can be described as follows. So type 1 civilization describes a species that has been able to harness all the energy that's available from a neighboring star and gathering and storing it to meet the energy demands and needs of a growing population. That civilization would also be able to boost current energy production over 100,000 times to reach this status. Would also have control over natural forces, volcanoes, weather, earthquakes, so on and so forth. Type 2 would describe a species that can harness the power of an entire star, actually controlling it. And there's nothing known to science that could actually wipe out this civilization. This would be a galactic civilization. Imagine something akin to Mass Effect 2. That's a galactic civilization. In the case of Type 1, it would be maybe Buck Rogers. And Type 3 is more like a Star Wars. It would be intergalactic. And this species or this civilization would be able to travel freely between different solar systems and colonize planets under virtually any circumstance. And at least according to Michio Kaku, human beings currently have a Type 0, or for more generous, a Type 0.7 or Type 0.8. And Kaku also believes that humans will achieve Type 1 status in about 100 to 200 years. Or we may not, because he also posits that we might never reach that stage, having destroyed ourselves in an effort to attain it. Now that you have an idea of different civilizational types, and in recognizing that we are Type 0, I want you to re-examine what I've been talking about this entire time. Now, we're supremely maladapted to a present and the future, for that matter, if we want to steal fire from the gods. And I'll make no secret of it, I think we should steal fire from the gods. Even if it's just trudging along the pace that's been dictated to us by evolution and limiting ourselves to that. Even if that's the goal, and for most of us I think it is the conscious goal, then it should still dawn upon us that civilizational progress is rather stunted in many regards. It really is errant nonsense on the part of many to claim that the best progress we can achieve shall be done so by doing what we've always done, which is effectively the argument you'll hear from most traditionalists. Just repeat the same ad nauseum and then you'll get results. Well, clearly it doesn't work. Look where we are right now. And whenever we speak of our evolutionary past and our modern present, I think we should always reflect upon the is-ought problem, first articulated by the Scottish philosopher and historian David Hume. And traditionally, of course, this has always been considered an ethical problem, this is-ought problem. And it remains its most important aspect. But I want to expand the problem a bit to encompass the large-scale question of civilizational progress. So we have our given biological circumstances handed down to us by millions of years of evolutionary development. And many, it seems, take this as a justification, or at least good enough reason to maintain a status quo that best served us 70,000 years ago. In contemplating the present ought versus the past is, we must ask ourselves the simple question of whether or not we should continue along the path of an is that differs little from the is of the most base animals. And for most of our history, that's what we've been doing. Or, alternatively, should we turn inward in reflecting upon what I've spoken of with regards to mimetic accumulation and propagation? Is that the type of ought we should be pursuing? I most certainly think it is. We've received these unique gifts during the course of evolution, and we can use these gifts to redefine ourselves as a species and create a visibly defined line delineated between the is of the past and the ought of the present and the future. And it seems to me if we wish to achieve earthly escape velocity for ourselves as a species, we are going to have to rethink the paradigms of the past, no matter how native they might be in the strictest biological sense. And in doing so, I'm of course not saying that we should ignore biology, as many are inclined to do, but rather become aware of it, acutely aware of it, and build upon it, 1,000-fold if possible. The biological gifts we have that make us truly unique and salient are known, but are routinely marginalized. It's not fucking or breeding or eating or shitting, but thinking, writing, discovering, understanding, and learning that make us unique. And we must reorganize ourselves and our thinking in that order if we want to become adaptive to the present and wish to leave behind what has effectively become a failed past relived in the present. And how do we do this? It's a simple question, and in reality, a large part of the answer is equally simple. What if I were to frame the answer in the form of a question itself? Is it more beneficial to the world to have greater numbers of smart people or greater numbers of dumb people? Assuming you don't want to live in a world a la Hume idiocracy, this is in principle rather easily achieved. Both men and women should rethink on a conscious level their programming when it comes to breeding. Now, Barbarossa, of course, had spoken of these issues in his video Powered by Orgasm, and I'm going to repeat a bit of it, but quite frankly, how is an optimal waist-to-hip ratio and nice hair and breasts the best solution for moving towards a Type 1 civilization? Now, you might, of course, be against moving towards a Type 1 civilization. I don't know why you would be, but I'm going to assume that you're actually for moving towards a Type 1 civilization, and eventually we'll all be dead to a Type 2 and 3. Now, men countenance this stupidity and ignorance in women because as much as men are creatures of reason and are very cerebral in nature, they're, I'd argue, equally cyberitic, creatures of the flesh, creatures of the carnal. Or as I like to call it sometimes, they're driven by the B&B principle, blowjobs and beer, B&B. And let's be honest here, many, if not most men, are content with everything if they simply receive their sex and blowjobs, their home-cooked meals, and folded clothing. And many men are simply content if they just receive their sex and blowjobs. Not good enough. Not good enough. And though it's clear that men are not only ruled by the B&B principle, if they were, of course, there'd be no civilization. It's strong enough in them to serve as a blockade in this most critical of matters. I really think it is a dichotomy in men and one that should be overcome. Had men not over countless millennia pursued a certain female phenotype, or for that matter, genotype, we would not be encountering this phenotype with a level of ubiquity that we do now. Men clearly, in a general sense, do not value intelligence in women as a most basic principle. Now, of course, many of you and others would protest, no, I think it's very sexy for a woman to be intelligent, so on and so forth. Let's look once again, and I'm going off script here, at proximate versus distal or ultimate causes. Most men don't get turned on. Very few men get turned on by a woman plugging in equations or doing advanced chemistry. Men, generally speaking, as a most basic principle of attraction, don't value intelligence. And I think we're lying to ourselves if we say that we do, generally speaking. And we certainly, on a conscious level, that's a nice attribute, but that's not the primary motivating factor, and certainly not universal to most men. And I'm going to get back to the script now. And women in this regard, of course, are not off the hook. Resource acquisition and accumulation need not equate to abstract and analytical intelligence. It can, but it's not a requirement, as women only care for intelligence to the extent that it allows men to accumulate resources that they can make use of. So let me give you a hypothetical scenario here. And I'm not claiming this actually happened, but I'm using it to make a point of illustration. And it might have happened. Who knows? So imagine some early hominid ancestor of ours. A particular male specimen discovered and implemented a very good means of spear fashioning and sharpening, which yielded more kills and more meat to bring back to the tribe than other men's spears or other techniques. This is clearly innovative. innovative. But the females that would have flocked to such a male specimen would have flocked to him not because of his innovation per se, but because of the byproducts of the innovation. In this way, I can paint a possible scenario as to how a certain degree of intelligence was valuable in sexual selection of males by females, but any male individual that went beyond this, or in a different direction, did not yield pragmatic results in the form of resources that females could use, would have been of little use to them, and thus ignored, consequently not reproducing and ending up in the dustbin of evolutionary prehistory. Hence my thesis is that intelligence was prized only to a degree, and I'm speaking of now females selecting males, I'll repeat that, intelligence was prized only to a degree, with the degree being delimited by its practical application with respect to female resource provision. Let me repeat that one last time. Intelligence was prized by females only to a degree, with the degree being delimited by its practical application with respect to female resource provision. If high degrees of intelligence had been prized by female hominid ancestors recurrently, we would see far, far greater occurrences of it in modernity across the globe, in the form of large numbers of scientists, inventors, thinkers, and arguably a different stage for our civilization than we currently have. So, why do we see so many nether apes? We might have our answer in that. So if we go back to the beginning of the video, you'll recall that intelligence is highly heritable, on average 70%, with that mean increasing with age, going up to about 80%. And considering that, I want to comment briefly on epigenetics. I think by and large, far too much has been made of epigenetics. Left-leaning culturalists, as I like to call them, who tend to reject biologically based explanations for human phenomena, often take hold of epigenetics as if it were the last bastion of pseudo-biological explanations of human behavior. And epigenetic changes can activate certain genes, but they do not change the DNA sequence of an organism. And modern epigenetics is essentially a resuscitation of Larmarckian theories that have yielded rather unremarkable results. I mean, Larmarckian theories on genetics are what you call, I suppose, soft Lamarckianism, have been only vindicated in the most basic sense. So I'll quote a publication on this. The cells of a body contain DNA, which contains genes. We inherit our genes, and they cannot be changed. The genes, however, have methyl groups attached, which affect what is known as gene expression. Whether the genes are activated or deactivated, the methyl groups can be influenced in various ways, through exercise, diet, and lifestyle, in a process known as DNA methylation. So, rather incredibly, exercise, diet, and lifestyle have an effect on your well-being, health, and, nothing we haven't known for a long time. It's about as remarkable as saying that practicing the piano for 5 years every day will make you a better piano player. I certainly hope it should. Who knew? But genes themselves, which we inherit, cannot be changed, at least not yet. Hopefully one day they can be. Everyone who will improve by practicing the piano for 5 years every day. Very few will become world-class pianists. We will all become faster by doing hill sprints for many years. Very, very few of us will become Olympic sprinters. And yes, we can study mathematics and physics daily till we're blue in the face, becoming better at it, but only a tiny fraction of us will become Nobel Prize-winning physicists and mathematicians. Thus, if we recognize that intelligence is highly heritable, we should also recognize that simply breeding for reasons of base attraction, the kind of attraction that was important in the days of yore, in prehistory, is suboptimal in producing the kinds of minds that lead to a modern civilization, which requires abstract and analytical intelligence for its erection, continued maintenance, and most importantly, advancement. I'm going to go off script again right now. Intelligence is highly heritable, and it's even less malleable than height is. That is to say, environmental factors have a greater influence on how tall you are than your native intelligence. And this is why it's so important for both men and women, particularly men, to change their mindset when it comes to breeding, because intelligence is heritable. And I'll get to this a bit later, but it's complicated. Brilliance, there's no gene that we've discovered for brilliance. This falls into the realm of what we call Emergenesis or Emergenics, which is basically the study of combinations of genes. truly amazing abilities such as truly amazing athletic ability or genius or incredible musical ability. This is a combinatorial process resulting from many genes. But it is a start if we focus in on intelligence as a primary factor. So, moving on back to the script. Barbaros had already mentioned the Chinese projects seeking to optimize intelligence, but I want to go further into detail on this. And I'm going to quote an evolutionary psychologist here who actually contributed his DNA to the project. Quote, "The BGI Cognitive Genomics Project is currently doing whole genome sequencing of 1,000 very high IQ people around the world, hunting for sets of IQ predicting alleles. I know because I recently contributed my DNA to the project, not fully understanding the implications. These IQ gene sets will be found eventually and will probably be used mostly in China for China. Potentially, the results would allow all Chinese couples to maximize the intelligence of their offspring by selecting among their own fertilized eggs for one or two that include the highest likelihood of the highest intelligence. Given the Mendelian genetic lottery, the kids produced by any one couple typically differ by 5 to 15 IQ points. So this method of pre-implantation embryo selection might allow IQ within every Chinese family to increase by 5 to 15 points per generation. After a couple of generations, it would be game over for Western global competitiveness." End quote. Now, for many, this would be akin to the death knell of some 20th century dystopian fantasy. And the Chinese interest here, admittedly, is primarily ethno-nationalistic, which I have no interest in supporting, and I find primitive. But the implications and the consequences of this stretch far and wide. And I'm going to quote the same evolutionary psychologist. Quote, "There is unusually close cooperation in China between government, academia, medicine, education, media, parents, and consumerism in promoting a utopian Han ethno-state. Given what I understand of evolutionary behavior genetics, I expect and hope that they will succeed. The welfare and happiness of the world's most populous country depend upon it. My real worry is the Western response. The most likely response, given Euro-American ideological biases, would be a bioethical panic that leads to criticism of Chinese population policy with the same self-righteous hypocrisy that we have shown in criticizing various Chinese sociocultural policies. But the global stakes are too high for us to act that stupidly and short-sightedly. A more mature response would be based on mutual civilizational respect, asking what we can learn from the Chinese and what the Chinese are doing, how can we help them, and how they can help us to keep up as they create their brave new world." Now, once again, I'm not personally interested in creating an ethno-state, but whatever their motivations and reasons, the Chinese have realized, and had done so a long time ago, that intelligence is key. It might not be that simple, of course. And intelligence, as I mentioned prior, seems to be emergenic, meaning it likely arises from the combined interaction of genes rather than just one specific one. But genetic optimization, as I'm inclined to call it, is a good idea, and that's what it is. It's not genetic engineering, it's optimizing what's already present, or activating things that aren't activated. There's simply no reason why people should shy away from the idea, and more importantly, there are simpler steps that human beings could take that do not involve laboratories and expensive research. Now, before I proceed, I want to make clear that everything I talk about from here on out is referring to individual choices and persons, that is, individual men and women moving towards this direction rather than done so at the behest of a government. I don't want government involved in this in the best case scenario, just an informed population. So, making abstract and analytical intelligence the primary factor in breeding for both men and women is the first step that should be taken. Continuing 100,000-year genetic traditions that has effectively turned out to be dysgenic in the modern world and counterproductive to building a truly advanced and modern society, constantly getting in the way of progress. I mean, you can see this in PUAs. I'm going off script. What do PUAs I mean, this is one example. This motivation that we have, particularly as men, to focus primarily on the physical has done naught for the progress of civilization. In the few cases where couples do yield prodigies and genius, this is just random mutation. This is not deliberated upon. Anyway, moving back to the script. Now, of course, one must be conscious of one's own drives in order to realize these things, and that's the reason I want to talk about the steps that men can take to move in this direction. One step that I think is very important is to follow a protocol of what I call post-politicism, or becoming a post-political man. Now, political ideologies, like all ideologies or memes, can have their merits or pitfalls. And the primary pitfall of all ideologies, religious or political, will inevitably lie in the specific tenets they maintain. And though there is some variation within specific directions, such as libertarianism, classical liberalism, socialism, or even centrism, each direction tells you that it is what is okay to believe and what is not okay to believe. So let me repeat that. Each political ideological direction tells you what is okay to believe and what is not okay to believe. And political ideology as such is effectively a straitjacket when it comes to new ideas and memes. If said ideas fall within the worldview of a particular ideology, they will be embraced and often used to bolster the ideology in a propagandistic fashion, or abused even. But adherents to the ideology will not embrace the ideas based on their own merit, rather only inasmuch as they serve to further that specific worldview. When ideas do not convene well with the ideology they adhere to, they will be rejected outright, declared false, and attempts will be made to discredit them. And that's not for lack of veridical content per se, but simply because they don't jive well with whatever the ideology tells you the world is supposed to be or look like. Adherence to specific political ideologies is, for that reason, antithetical to a scientific worldview, and the scientific method that sets out to test hypotheses and then proceeds based on evidence doesn't jive well with it, doesn't mesh well with it. Political ideologies carry with them preconceived and often poorly attested notions about the world and the human beings in the world and how they work and how they function. So let's have a look at a few of them. So let's have a look at pure libertarianism. And I'm very sympathetic to libertarianism, though I wouldn't call myself that. I'm, of course, post-political. So libertarianism tells us, rather axiomatically, that the government produces nothing of value, and this does usually seem to be true, but there are exceptions. So the origins of the Internet can be found in the U.S. military, perhaps the most socialist organization on earth. Paul Barron developed the first Internet-like package switching networks in the service of the U.S. military in the 1960s. And if we move forward, eventually we end up with the Internet. And of course, the Internet is pretty useful, and of course it's been worked on in the private sector as well. But that doesn't change the fact that it had originally been developed in a socialized, socialistic government context. And if you're a purist libertarian, you're going to have to reject that. You're going to have to find some alternative explanation, lest you concede that something of value had been produced by the government. Now, this might seem a minor issue, but the main point I'm focusing on here is that political ideologies, as well as religious ones, particularly political ones, put you in a straitjacket. It's a preconceived notion of the way the world is supposed to be, look like, and how you're supposed to think. And if facts become counterfactual to the so-called alleged facts that you have embraced within your ideology, you have a problem. And this is just a small example. So moving on. Let's say you're a left-leaning socialist. You might follow the doctrine that all human beings, independent of race and sex, are the same, and that differences are the result of socialization. And indeed, for many, many, many decades, this has been the credo of the left. And they tend to apply it a priori to everything, including scientific findings that contradict their worldview. So recent studies, just as an example, have shown that the gene, ACTN3, is one of the primary factors involved in performance in sports, such as sprinting, explosive power, and allows for greater bursts of explosive energy. Jamaicans who dominate sprinting have much greater occurrences of ACTN3 than do other people and ethnic groups. And this has been empirically studied and proven many times and can be tested. After all, in a sprint, in a race, there are clear winners and losers. Have Jamaicans, most of whom have West African origin, been socialized to be such? Was Usain Bolt dubbed the fastest man in the world socialized to be the fastest man in the world? Of course not. But if you find yourself trapped within the rigid confines of left-leaning political ideology, the genetic inheritance factor cannot be acknowledged at all, since this could be applied to any political ideology in the world using specific examples. In the case of left-leaning culturalism, as I like to call it, The idea that we're all, as is often called, a blank slate with nothing inscribed upon it, and the world just gives us input, and that's how we grow and evolve as individuals, that's what really contradicts, in their own minds, the scientific findings of modernity. And the science is actually science as opposed to what they're inclined to do. But once again, this is a problem of political ideology. And all political ideologies necessarily suffer from this flaw because their worldview is fixed and constrained by a priori assumptions about what the world is like, not a possible hypothesis that can be tested. And as such, whether right or left, or somewhere in between, in the middle, it is impossible to be objectively and dispassionately interested in the truth. Now you might be asking yourself, why is it important to be objectively interested in the truth? Because objectivity is essential if you want to understand the world and further human knowledge. That's how science is done. And it's essential to you if you want to be a thinking ape and a thinking man, as opposed to a nether ape. And this is the foremost reason to jettison all political claptrap to the side and practice post-politicism, and examine each issue on its own merits within the context that gave rise to it. And I encourage all men, and women as well, to the extent that they can or want to become post-political. That would be a big step in the right direction. So I believe I've touched upon the concept of the apex mind in the past. Now these are people whose minds operate at levels far beyond our own. Luminaries such as Newton, Archimedes, Einstein, Tesla, these are the minds I would classify as apex minds. Now, apart from the obviously phenomenal intelligence they have, apex minds seem to varying degrees to have a very different hierarchy of priorities when it comes to their native biology with regards to sex. And even in cases where they do copulate and reproduce, such as Einstein, apex minds all seem to be far more driven by mimetic propagation than they do genetic propagation, which is to say they are moved primarily by ideas, idea-driven versus sex-driven. And this is the dichotomy within many, many men. You have the cerebral, idea-driven man, and you have the cyberitic, sex-driven man. And I think that a relegation of the sex drive to a secondary or tertiary rank is very helpful no matter what the intelligence of the man might be. And these sorts of minds exist in modernity as well. So I'm going to ask you to pause the video briefly and check out a link or two. And in the first link, you'll see a child prodigy programmer. His name is Santiago. And I want you to notice what he says to the reporter interviewing him. It's at 3:24 in the video. And you can see it in the link. Quote, "No, I'm not interested in having a girlfriend. I consider it a tremendous waste of time." Now, normally, if you're in the throes of puberty, you're kind of interested in, well, only girls. I mean, you have no interest in anything else. The apex mind is different. And I've spoken prior of a concept that I sort of introduced, artificially induced asexuality. But many apex minds seem almost naturally inclined to be so because their drive for knowledge and ideas exceeds their sex drive. And admittedly, I'm far from an apex mind, but I have, after study, analysis, and much thought, also come to the conclusion. I think all men would do well to at least partially emulate the apex mind in this regard. And I'm not simply being puritanical, but I'm speaking of the real consequences of directing our attention to matters that should be relegated to a distant tertiary as opposed to a primary, such as the pursuit of sex. We can do better. And if men wish to pursue sex and women as their highest calling, fine. But let's not grant them any dignity, or more importantly, let's not let them maintain the illusion that this is a particularly valuable expenditure of time and energy. And we talked about this before, but it really needs to be highlighted here, that these apex minds are naturally inclined to pursue knowledge, to understand the world and the universe, and they don't have that raging dichotomy that many of us feel. And I think it's something that's worthy of emulation and would be a step in the right direction. Now recall the B&B principle. Men are both cyberitic creatures and creatures of the mind. And I think all men would benefit from stepping back and asking themselves which of these aspects should be ascendant in their lives individually and indeed across the globe. Just imagine once again I'm going off script, a hypothetical scenario where men en masse at least try to emulate what seems to come naturally to these apex minds. Society would be transformed globally, and I think for the better. There would be more science done, there would be more interesting research done, there would be less waste because men wouldn't be wasting their resources chasing women, and the entire game could be reorganized in a positive fashion. Now, there are several important reasons for this. One, I've made the case that memes are ultimately more powerful than genes, although ultimately a derivative of genes, and that positive, that is, good ideas, positive mimetic accumulation is possibly the principal mechanism and maybe the most powerful mechanism for the erection, maintenance, and advancement of human civilization. Men of the sort I've mentioned have created tremendous mimetic momentum that still moves and affects us today. And to a much lesser degree, we can do the same in an effort to create a ripple effect that builds upon itself. This would be the effect that would take place if men in significant numbers were to emulate this principle. So if and when men do choose to reproduce, they would be best served by doing so exclusively with women who are manifestly very intelligent, with intense interest in the sciences, ideas, and knowledge in general, rather than how hot she looks in the bikini. In fact, I don't think looks should play, assuming they're not hideous, a role at all, not for the purposes of reproduction. This is not about attraction, ladies and gentlemen. This is about creating a generation of human beings, of Homo sapiens, that is optimized to create a type 1 civilization, to push the boundaries of our understanding to the limit and beyond. Now, I want to talk about a science and idea-driven economy versus a purely profit-driven economy. So let me preface this by saying that some degree of profit drive is necessary, and there will always be some people who will only value direct and tangible profit. So in saying that, I'm speaking of a more balanced economic model, a different perspective on something that we already have. Now, of course, I expect many accusations to be hurled at me for even broaching the topic, but I'm most certainly not against the free market. I think it's highly imperfect, but there doesn't seem to be very much else out there that works much better, at least in the loose sense of the term free market. But in recognizing that, and perhaps even acknowledging just how imperfect a purely profit-driven free market is, we must surely see that many things produced in the free market are not valuable at all. So let's look at some of the useless trash and baubles, such as women's handbags, high heels, severely overpriced clothing and wedding rings, and all the rest of the other junk that's produced in the free market. I mean, Beyonce, Justin Bieber, mindless entertainers. These are all products produced in the free market, produced to meet the demand of the consumer, but their value in terms of expanding the base of human knowledge and providing really anything but very limited and effete entertainment is non-existent. And in the case of the products preferred by females, it's the market reacting to the female consumer demands. And we know that female consumption comprises 70% of market consumption. The question to pose here is how useful, or better put, mimetically relevant and helpful, is the mass production of products such as the ones I've mentioned, or entertainers, whose audience is almost exclusively female. Remember, memes can be good or bad, and we can look at economic structures as a form of mimetic accumulation. So the idea is, or rather the question is, a purely profit-driven economy that seeks to maximize profits but not human knowledge an optimal structure for advancing into the future? I think it's hit or miss. Sometimes companies and individuals will research things for the sake of profits, as is the case with pharmaceutical companies, but the knowledge they might acquire is a distant second to the profits they acquire as a motivator. Many of the greatest scientific discoveries made have been done for the sake of passion for understanding and learning. And to the extent that they did yield profits, these profits came much, much later, and were certainly not the raison d'etre of those who had made the discoveries. Think of the great thinkers and scientists of the 17th and 18th century. The Galileos, the Newtons, the David Humes, and many, many others. These were men of learning, Leibniz, who really were just interested in the learning. They didn't, obviously they had to eke out an existence, but they weren't thinking, I need to make money. Moving on. The question is, how does a pair of $500 high heels contribute to the body of human knowledge? The answer is, of course, patently obvious. It doesn't contribute to the body of human knowledge. It's trash, and it's produced to satisfy female consumer need. And with all things, its production requires a certain expenditure of time and energy, which I believe is time and energy best spent elsewhere. But it goes beyond that. It goes beyond that. I mean, how does a hedge fund manager contribute to the body of human knowledge? He makes a great deal of money, but that's about it. And the same can be said for a host of other professions. Coca-Cola, entertainers, the list is endless. And before we proceed, I mean, this has been talked about at length, we need to consider why it is that men pursue wealth. Many men who would otherwise be content to live in modest comfort without excess, as long as they can pursue their interests, engage instead in excessive labor and exceedingly long work hours to amass wealth. Why are they doing that? And this is, once again, discussed very often. But I don't think, at least in concrete terms, the link between the economy and that mode of being, the man seeking to amass wealth to impress women, following his reproductive drives, has ever been made. Men, of course, they do this to attract females, even if they're unaware of it, on a proximate level. It's almost automatic. It's this automaticity of thought that we still have as a primitive species. And men are still the primary contributors to the economy. But they more often than not, contribute not for themselves or for the things that interest them, but for the sake of being attractive to women. This is true not universally, but in very, very large circles of men. Men might rationalize it all they want, but fancy cars, expensive housing, all these things, I would argue that a majority of men are simply not interested in this per se. It's done to impress women. Now, it's fairly simple. Most wealth is produced by men, and most consumption is done by women. And the women hold the wealth that men produce and make the decisions as to what should be done with the wealth. Given all this, I have to draw the conclusion that profit simply for profit's sake is pursued primarily for the sake of prehistoric mating behavior that dictates what we do today. It's gynocentric. Now, whether we want to admit that or not, saying something such as purely profit-driven economies are gynocentric in nature because you can see the kind of crap that gets produced in it is not that far off the mark. And this is the autopilot function that rules much of our being. We give it no thought, and when we do not believe it could be different because that's the way it's always been. Something to consider. Now, you might remember Esta Villar, or if you want to use the Spanish pronunciation, Esther Villar, and she talks about this to a certain extent. She talks about men giving up their dreams to pursue dismally boring, unsatisfactory careers, and why they do it. Quote, "We have long ceased to play the games of childhood. As children, we became bored quickly and changed from one game to another. A man is like a child who is condemned to play the same game for the rest of his life. The reason is obvious. As soon as he is discovered to have a gift for one thing, he is made to specialize. Then, because he can earn more money in that field than another, he is forced to do it forever. If he was good at maths in school, if he had a head for figures, he will be sentenced to a lifetime of figure work as a bookkeeper, a mathematician, or computer operator, for there lies his maximum work potential. Therefore, he will add up figures, press buttons, and add up more figures, but he will never be able to say, 'I'm bored, I want to do something else.' The woman who is exploiting him will never permit him to look for something else. Driven by this woman, he may engage in a desperate struggle against competitors to improve his position and perhaps become head clerk or managing director of a bank. But isn't the price he is paying for his improved salary rather too high? The fear of being rejected by society must be considerable. Why else will a doctor who as a child like to observe tadpoles in jam jars spend his life opening nauseating growths, examining and pronouncing on human excretions? Why else does he busy himself night and day with people of such repulsiveness that everyone else is driven away? Does a pianist as a child like to tinkle on the piano, really enjoy playing the same Chopin nocturne over and over all of his life? Why else does a politician who as a schoolboy discovered the techniques of manipulating people successfully continue as an adult, mouthing words and phrases as a modern government functionary? Does he actually enjoy contorting his face and playing the fool and listening to the idiotic chatter of other politicians? Surely, he must once have dreamed of a different kind of life, even if he became President of the United States. Wouldn't the price be too high? It's stale, perfunctory, and uninspiring. And yet the world and its economy has been built upon this principle. Now, I believe what Villard alluded to is part of the problem. Much of the world is run on the labor and production of things that have little or to nothing to do with the propagation of good ideas and memes and discovery, and even less to do with the men being content at what they do. Now, can someone honestly tell me that Coca-Cola is a net positive force in the world? Now, before someone accuses me of being against profits, I'm simply pointing out that profit alone is a poor mechanism with which to build an advanced civilization. And profit can, and often does, override truth. Look at Coca-Cola again. They have PR people that spout scientifically untenable and unsupported lies about human nutrition and metabolism in order to maximize their profits, while people are dying of diabetes type 2 due to the consumption of beverages such as the ones they offer. And once again, I'm not even claiming that they should be prevented from doing so, but rather that a scientifically informed and knowledge-thirsty population will be virtually immune to such mendacious PR. And this type of population would likely not buy Coca-Cola products at all. And we go back to the point of intelligence. We need to start in the realm of intelligence. Intelligent people, though certainly not universally, would be less inclined once they understood some of these principles of metabolism and nutrition to buy products of that sort. But that is a purely profit-driven model, Coca-Cola. It contributes, well, virtually nothing in the way of human discovery. And so what I'm presenting is the concept of an idea, science, and knowledge-driven economy, where short-term profit is only part of the conceptualization of economy. Our notion of productivity is quite simply not an idea-driven one. We waste a lot of time doing things that don't further our own personal knowledge or the knowledge of humanity at large. So, for example, recently, it was discovered by entomologists that dung beetles orient themselves by using the Milky Way. Now, the likelihood that this discovery will yield any sort of significant profit is slim. But these sorts of investigations are exactly what is needed for the reason of the fact that long-term benefit is often times unpredictable. It could be the first step in better understanding insect navigation. Maybe when insect navigation is better understood, we could implement it into human navigation systems. We simply don't know. So how many of the great scientific discoveries and ideas of the past were thought at the time to lead to profit? And did the apex minds of those times pursue their ideas for reasons of monetary compensation, or because they were driven to understand the world and its workings? Their contributions to human knowledge and the advanced state of the world we live in are incalculable. There is no monetary quantifiable that you could ascribe to what they've done. Einstein, Bohr, Newton, Pasteur, Darwin, Feynman, and the list goes on and on. And we live in a world that was made possible by men exactly like that, idea-driven men. Whatever their native intelligence, they were men driven by ideas. And we could live in a fashion that reflects their drives and motives, because that's innate to us as well, particularly as men. We have that dichotomy, but we can choose which aspect of the dichotomy, the cyberitic or the cerebral, is ascendant and primary in us. And all that's required for this to happen is a shift in mentality, which I admit is highly improbable, but it's possible. And we can continue to labor on and labor about as nether apes, chained to our biology, stumbling into the future, or alternatively, we can learn to appreciate our biological legacy as the salient lucky ape, the thinking ape, and ramp up our efforts in doing so, and doing what has brought human progress to us, and understanding its basis in an honest and objective way. The suggestions I have made are all actionable, but require a complete and total shift away from the mindset of the nether ape, the normal standard human mindset effectively, whose principal interest is in eating, fucking, and breeding. That's going to get done regardless. It's the other things that we have to pay attention to if we want to push our species forward into the future. And in doing so, we can, in fact, plant the seeds for an earthly escape velocity. We can exceed ourselves. It's just a question of will. Will it happen? I don't know. But I've hopefully offered the groundwork to do so. Anyway, that's the end of this video. Thanks for watching. Appreciated. And hopefully we'll talk soon. Completely voluntary, but donations are very much appreciated. They really do help me to literally survive and fight another day and make videos of this depth and length. So thanks for watching, and I will talk to all of you hopefully soon. Until then, everyone take care. Bye-bye.